They arrested a quiet nurse for stolen valor, and the whole courtroom laughed in her face, until a judge picked up her medal and went dead silent, because what he was holding in his hands was real. The doors swung open and she walked in wearing handcuffs and hospital scrubs under a borrowed gray jacket, and the gallery lost it, actual laughter, the kind that echoes off courtroom walls, because nothing about her screamed soldier, nothing about her screamed captain. She looked like a woman who just pulled a 30-hour shift and hadn't slept a wink, which, as it turned out, was exactly the truth. Officers had walked into Harlow County Medical Center at 7:43 that morning and pulled her out in front of every nurse, every orderly, every patient rolling down that hallway, and slapped her with charges that don't get thrown around lightly. Stolen valor, fraudulent military impersonation, illegal possession of a classified combat decoration. The gallery had already made up its mind. They'd seen the local news. They'd read the headline. They'd decided who she was before she ever opened her mouth. Up at the bench, Judge Gerald Finn sat reviewing the file with the kind of careful, unreadable expression of a man who hadn't picked a side yet, until the bailiff asked the defendant to set her medal on the evidence table. And she did it herself, no hesitation, no drama. And Judge Finn leaned in. He reached for his glasses. He looked again. Then he set them down slow, and in a room still buzzing with contempt, he said something so quiet only the court clerk beside him caught it. That medal's authentic. Nobody else heard it. Not yet. But she heard it, the woman standing there in cuffs. And for 1 second, something shifted behind her eyes. Not relief. Not victory. Just the bone-tired recognition that the truth she'd been carrying alone, for years, had finally cracked the surface. Her name was Mara Voss. And folks, this wasn't even close to the worst day of her life. Harlow County sat tucked in a valley between two mountain ranges nobody ever bothered naming anything special. The kind of town where the hospital's the biggest employer in town and everybody's business is everybody's business, which meant when something went sideways for you, it went sideways loud and public with a whole audience ready to weigh in. Mara had worked trauma at Harlow County Medical for 6 straight years. Showed up early, stayed late. Never volunteered a single detail about herself unless someone flat out asked. The nurses liked her well enough. The surgeons put up with her. And the charge nurse, a woman named Bernadette Oye, once told a rookie hire that if you ever found yourself in a real crisis, the kind where nobody's guaranteed to walk out alive, you wanted Mara Voss standing next to you. Not because she was warm and fuzzy, not because she made anybody feel better, but because she was calm the way a brick wall is calm, solid, unmovable, completely untouched by panic. She lived alone in a rented house 11 minutes from the hospital, ran 5 miles every single morning before sunup, kept a beat-up shepherd mix named Ruger who had a gray muzzle and a real talent for sleeping smack in the middle of doorways. 2 houseplants, both thriving. 1 photograph on her nightstand she never once talked about. And what she really never talked about, not ever, was her life before that hospital. People tried, the way small-town co-workers always try. They'd catch her zoning out on a slow shift and ask where her head had gone. Nowhere interesting, she'd say, and go right back to charting. Somebody noticed her hands didn't shake during a code. Not even the kind of code that had the residents backed up against the wall, and asked how. Been doing this a long time, she'd say. Somebody else clocked the way she scanned a room the second she walked into it. Eyes cutting to the exits and the faces before she'd even thought about grabbing coffee, and asked if she'd done anything before nursing. Some things, she'd say. Nothing worth telling. The man who decided that answer wasn't good enough was named Roland Pace. Roland Pace held the title of Administrative Director of Operations at Harlow County Medical. Sounded impressive, wasn't really. Sat behind a desk on the 4th floor juggling scheduling headaches and supply disputes and every ounce of small hospital office politics you can imagine. Budgets stretched thin, egos stretched thinner. 44 years old. An MBA from a state school, he brought up every chance he got. And 3 years deep into convincing himself he was 2 promotions away from a VP title the hospital board kept quietly slipping just out of his reach. He and Mara had only crossed paths twice before everything blew up. The first time was over a supply audit. Mara had caught a discrepancy in the trauma ward's medication logs. Expensive consumables billed out that didn't match what was actually sitting on the shelf, and she'd walked a printed report straight to his office. He thanked her, told her he'd handle it, then sat on it for 3 weeks before quietly filing it away and forgetting it ever existed. The discrepancy never got fixed. The second time was the hospital's annual recognition dinner, an event Mara hadn't planned on attending until Bernadette talked her into it. Pace gave a speech that night, rattled off the trauma unit's numbers, name-dropped the charge nurse and a couple of attending physicians, never once said Mara's name, even though the case he bragged about as the unit's crowning achievement, a mass casualty event 8 months back, had been run almost single-handedly by her from the second the first ambulance rolled in. She didn't care about the speech, not really. What stuck with her was the look on Pace's face afterward, catching her not caring, and how much that seemed to eat at him. The third run-in was the one that changed everything. It started with a busted locker. Mara's locker had a faulty latch she'd been flagging to facilities for 2 straight months, and on a Thursday morning in late October, she clocked in and found the door hanging wide open, her stuff scattered inside. She straightened it up, tied the handle shut with a hair elastic, made a mental note to bug facilities again, because that's how she handled things, not with anger, with follow-through. It wasn't until nearly 11 that morning she realized the small cedar box tucked in the back was gone. Nothing flashy about it. Inside sat a folded photograph, same one on her nightstand, and a military medal in its original case, a Valor cross. The name engraved on that case read Captain Theodore Voss, her late father, and underneath it, added later through proper legal channels, presented with equal commendation to Captain Mara Voss. She'd had it modified after his death, fully documented, nothing shady, and deeply personal in a way she'd never had to explain to a soul at that hospital, because she'd never needed to before. She spent 40 minutes tearing the place apart before heading to security. The footage showed a maintenance worker popping her locker open at 9:15 to check the busted latch. He swore he'd found the box on the floor and set it on a shelf outside the lockers so it wouldn't get stepped on. Roland Pace's office sat 20 feet from that exact shelf. She never confirmed whether he'd seen it. What she did know was that by the next morning, a formal complaint had landed on hospital administration's desk, copied straight to the county sheriff, claiming a nursing staffer was walking around with a stolen military medal, impersonating a decorated officer, possibly lying about her background since day one of hiring. Signed and dated, Roland Pace, Director of Administrative Operations. Mara found out the way people in small towns always find out, through somebody who cared enough to give her a heads up. Bernadette showed up in the trauma bay an hour before her shift even started and laid it out low and fast. Roland filed something on you, she said. Something about a medal. Mara kept restocking her cart, didn't even pause. What kind of something? He's saying you've been claiming a military background you don't actually have. That the medal in your locker is stolen. A beat. Is it? No. You got paperwork to prove it? Mara thought about the files sitting behind her, some of them classified, some buried in systems that don't have public addresses, some that needed clearance most people never touch. Yeah, she said. It's just complicated. How complicated? The kind that takes time to verify. Bernadette looked at her the way you look at someone you're genuinely worried about. Mara, this isn't just an HR write-up. He copied the sheriff. I know. You need a lawyer. I know. You gonna call one? After shift. She never made it to the end of that shift. The deputies rolled up at 11:20, 2 uniforms and a plainclothes investigator, paperwork technically in order even if the substance behind it was shaky, filed under a state statute for fraudulent military impersonation and pushed through faster than any normal timeline allowed, like somebody with courthouse connections had leaned on the gas pedal. They cuffed her right there in the hallway outside the trauma bay, in front of Bernadette, 3 other nurses, and a family waiting on word about their father. Mara didn't fight it. I need somebody to cover my patients, was all she said. And when Bernadette promised she'd handle it, Mara nodded and walked out of that hospital without another word. Sitting in the back of that patrol car, watching Harlow County's flat valley slide by, all she could think was this was going to take a while. The proof existed, but the channels to pull it were slow, tangled, nowhere near fast enough. And in the meantime, the story Roland Pace had written was going to fill every empty space the truth hadn't gotten to yet. She was dead right. The arraignment landed in front of a visiting judge, Gerald Fun, rotated into Harlow County to chip away at a backlog, 62, gray-haired, the kind of measured bearing you only get from decades of making calls that wreck or save lives and learning to carry that weight. Prosecuting was Victor Sloan, 37, hungry. Still smarting from a big embezzlement case he'd lost that the local paper had chewed on for 2 weeks straight. He needed a win that played well in the press, and a stolen valor case involving a small-town nurse in scrubs was, PR-wise, about as clean a shot as they come. He showed up dressed like it was already trial day and made sure the hearing landed on the public docket where local news couldn't miss it. The gallery wasn't packed, but a reporter from the Harlow Register sat in the third row, notebook ready, 2 guys from a veterans advocacy group planted in back already muttering low and angry, a handful of hospital staff scattered around for the drama, not the concern. Mara sat at the defense table in that same gray jacket over her scrubs because nobody had offered her a change and she hadn't bothered asking. Her public defender, 29-year-old Cassidy Holt, for years into the job, leaned over and murmured, "Don't react to anything he says. Zero expression. That's kind of my default setting," Mara said. Cassidy studied her for a second. "Right. Okay then." Victor Sloan opened with a statement that wasn't exactly kosher for an arraignment, but Judge Finn let him run for a minute before stepping in. In that minute, Sloan painted Mara as a woman who'd built a fake military identity to win her coworkers' trust, who'd stolen the name and honor of a real decorated officer, who'd been using a fraudulent medal as a prop in an ongoing con. The gallery reacted exactly like a gallery that's already made up its mind, murmuring, head shakes, one veteran muttering something under his breath that carried further than he meant it to. Mara didn't flinch. The medal got placed on the evidence table, and Sloan gestured at it with the kind of theatrical disgust that plays better for a crowd than an actual argument does. "Mr. Sloan." Judge Funn's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "This is an arraignment." "Yes, Your Honor." "Then let's treat it like one." Sloan sat down, looking only slightly chastened, but he'd already gotten what he came for. The Register reporter was writing fast. It was in the brief recess after the plea got entered, not guilty, flat, immediate, zero elaboration, that Judge Finn picked up the evidence bag holding the medal and looked at it the way you'd examine something during a routine check. He wasn't technically supposed to be forming opinions yet. He looked at it a long time. It was a real Valor cross. Even bagged, even under the flat fluorescent lights of Courtroom 3, it carried that exact weight and finish only the genuine article ever has. Finn had spent 8 years as an Army JAG officer before switching to civilian practice. He knew the difference between an authentic commendation and a store-bought knockoff better than most anyone in that building. He said nothing. He set it down. He adjourned the session. But he kept thinking about it. The story broke online that evening and hit print the next morning. Harlow nurse arrested for stolen valor. They ran her hospital ID photo, leaked through channels that weren't exactly above board, and she looked wiped out in it, which tracked because ID photos always get snapped between shifts. The veterans group put out a statement calling the whole thing an insult to everyone who ever served. The hospital posted a notice suspending her clinical privileges pending investigation. She went home to Ruger and got to work with what she had. A public defender who was sharp but drowning in caseload, a prosecutor building his whole case around records nobody could quickly reach, a town that had already reached its verdict, and the cold knowledge that the truth, real, documented, undeniable, lived locked behind systems that don't move at the speed of public opinion. She dialed a number she hadn't called in 4 years. It rang 6 times, hit voicemail, no name attached, just a tone. She left an 11-second message that would mean absolutely nothing to anybody who wasn't supposed to understand it. Then she waited. The preliminary hearing got set for 8 days out. In between, Sloan kept stacking paperwork, and Pace gave 2 separate interviews, one to the Register, one to a regional TV station, casting himself as the concerned administrator who'd simply done his civic duty. He said the word stolen 7 times across those 2 interviews. He wore a flag pin to the TV sit-down he never wore to the office. 2 days before the hearing, Cassidy called with news that wasn't great. He's added a witness, she said. Former military records consultant. Says the medal's designation doesn't match any female personnel file from that service period. He's wrong, Mara said. Can you prove it? A pause. Not fast. How not fast are we talking? Weeks. Maybe longer. The records I need require clearance levels that don't run through standard FOIA channels. Cassidy went quiet for a second, papers shuffling on her end. Mara, I have to ask you something straight. Is there anything about your military history you're choosing not to tell me? Not judging, I just need to know before Sloan finds it first. The line stayed quiet long enough Cassidy nearly repeated herself. No, Mara finally said. I'm not hiding anything by choice. Some of it's still classified. That's different. Classified as in actually classified? Yes. Another pause. Okay, Cassidy said. Then we need to find some other way to buy time. That other way showed up on the morning of the preliminary hearing, and nobody in that building could have planned for it. The courtroom was fuller this time, the story had legs, and Harlow County wasn't exactly used to stories with legs. Sloan sat at his table radiating the kind of prepared energy you only get from a man who thinks he's already won. The medal sat back on the evidence table. Mara did what she was good at, being completely present without looking affected, scanning the room, clocking exits, clocking the bailiff, the clerk, the court reporter, and one deputy standing at the back left corner of the gallery. Deputy First Class Aaron Meade, early 50s, a little heavy, collar too tight, and a face that had gone a wrong shade of gray on his walk-in from the parking lot. She'd clocked it the second he came through the door. Wrong color. She watched him and said nothing because there was nothing to say yet. Judge Finn called the session to order. Sloan launched into his presentation, 6 minutes into walking the chain of evidence, citing his consultant's upcoming testimony, building his fraud narrative with the smooth efficiency of a man who's rehearsed his own script, when Aaron Meade's hand came up slow and touched the wall. Mara was already on her feet. No announcement, no theater, one motion, up and moving through the gallery before the deputy's knees had even finished buckling. She was beside him when he hit the floor, fingers at his neck, and her voice cut across that room the same way it cut across a trauma bay running 3 crises at once. Someone called dispatch, cardiac event, courthouse, courtroom 3. Clear a path to the main door right now. I need an AED, there's one in the lobby by the security desk. The room, dead quiet a second ago for all the wrong reasons, snapped into motion. Sloan sputtered, is she? She's a nurse, she's not supposed to, Mr. Sloan. Funn's voice carried. Sit down. She worked without narrating a single move, checked his airway, his breathing, his pulse gone, a faint flutter, gone again, and dropped into compressions with the kind of mechanical precision that only comes from muscle memory, not thought. A young woman from the gallery sprinted the AED in, someone who'd clearly taken a training course recently and knew exactly what to do. Mara took it, slapped the pads on without breaking rhythm any longer than protocol demanded. Listened to the machine's voice without letting it override her own read on the situation. The shock fired. She went right back to compressions. 40 seconds later, his chest rose on its own. She didn't back off. Stayed with him, monitoring, keeping him steady, talking low and even. You're okay. Stay with me. You're okay. When the paramedics rolled a gurney in, she gave a 45-second handoff that hit every single relevant point, including her own estimate of when the onset had started based on watching him across the room. The paramedic, young, sharp, clearly good at his job, looked at her when she finished. "You military?" "Not currently," she said. He gave a single nod that meant something, and they wheeled meat out. The courtroom went dead silent. Mara walked back to the defense table, sat down, smoothed her jacket like nothing had happened. Sloan was staring at her with the look of a man who just felt the floor shift under a structure he'd spent weeks building. Not sure yet how much had moved, but he could feel it moving. Judge Finn looked at her a long moment, looked at the metal, looked back at her. "We'll take a 30-minute recess." He didn't say it with his usual clipped efficiency. He said it like a man who suddenly needed time to think about something a whole lot bigger than his schedule. Out in the hallway, Cassidy grabbed her arm. "What just happened?" "Anterior wall STEMI. He'll need a cath if they move fast. He should be okay." "No, I mean you, in front of the whole room, somebody needed help and you just—" Cassidy pressed a hand to her mouth. Sloan looked like he swallowed something. "I noticed." The judge noticed too. Mara looked down at the scuffed linoleum, then back at the courtroom door. "Doesn't change the legal situation. He's still got his case. I still don't have my records." "No," Cassidy said, "but he doesn't have the room anymore. Every person in there just watched you save that man's life. They walked in ready to call you a liar, and now half of them are sitting there wondering what else they got wrong." When the recess ended, Sloan came back in and adjusted on the fly, smart enough to know the room's sympathy had shifted, and experienced enough to know the right move wasn't to fight that, it was to steer around it. He pivoted hard away from anything touching Mara's competence, unwinnable ground after what 30 people had just watched, and built everything around paperwork instead: documentation, verification, the legal bar for military decoration eligibility. He called his witness, Dale Pute, a guy who'd spent 12 years in military records administration before going private, and walked him through a clean, procedural takedown that never once attacked Mara personally. The medal's designation, Pute testified, didn't line up with documented female personnel assignments from that unit during that period. Not proof of fraud, but inconsistent, and inconsistent, Sloan argued, was reason enough for the court to demand hard documentation before tossing the charge. Cassidy's cross-exam landed a solid hit. Pute hadn't personally reviewed Mara's file because that file wasn't accessible through normal channels, and his whole conclusion was built on general pattern analysis, not specifics. Pute admitted it flat out, no shame about it, because it was true. It didn't prove Mara was lying. It just confirmed nobody could currently prove she wasn't, which was exactly the ground Sloan wanted to stand on. Finn called both attorneys up to the bench. When Sloan came back, his face was doing that careful neutral thing. When Cassidy came back, she leaned in close. "He's extending the preliminary phase. Wants DOD verification before we go to trial." "How long?" 3 weeks. Mara ran the math. 3 weeks beat trial, but 3 weeks also meant 3 more weeks of suspended privileges, 3 more weeks of the story finding new legs, 3 more weeks of Roland Pace doing God knows what. "He pulled the evidence bag during the recess," Cassidy added. "Made a call." Mara looked toward the bench, where Finn sat writing something, face unreadable. 12 minutes, Cassidy said, long enough for someone to answer and actually listen, and Mara had her own theory about who Finn might know, based on his bearing, his age, the JAG photo she'd caught through his half-open chamber door. "I made a call too before the hearing," Mara admitted. Cassidy's eyebrows shot up. "You could have told me that. Wasn't sure it'd go anywhere. And now? Still not sure. More likely than before." Court adjourned. The gallery filed out, the register reporter lingering by the evidence table until the bailiff waved him off. Sloan left without looking at Mara this time, a real shift from how he'd walked in, all easy confidence, paperwork bulletproof. Something in the last 90 minutes had thrown a wrench in his gears, and he was headed home to figure out how big a wrench. Mara drove home into the thin October light, sat in her car 3 full minutes before starting it. the way she always needed a minute to switch from being watched to just being alone. Ruger was waiting. She had 3 weeks, and one phone call that may or may not have landed anywhere useful. What she hadn't told Cassidy, because it wasn't Cassidy's weight to carry, was exactly what those records were going to say once they finally surfaced. Not just her father's service, not just a properly filed inscription update, but her own 8 years, unit designations that don't show up in any public database, an operational record most DoD administrators never get clearance to see, commendations processed across 3 separate offices over 6 months because the standard system was never built for what she'd actually done, or where she'd done it. She'd enlisted at 22 after 2 years of nursing school, handpicked for a specialized medical role in a unit that recruited specifically because she was, in the recruiter's words, exceptional and invisible, the kind of person who could stand in a room and nobody would remember her face. 8 years. 3 deployments. 17 people under her direct medical care in the field. Every single one of them came home breathing. She'd walked away when her father got sick, chose to be there for his last year instead of finishing her run, and never once second-guessed that call. He died 8 months after she left the service. She buried him with the medal on the casket, then couldn't leave it in the ground, took it back home, filed for the inscription 6 weeks later, approved in 4. None of that was visible to a single person in Harlow County. All of it was fully documentable. It just lived behind walls that took time to open. That night, the hospital started moving. The suspension notice had gone out official channels, which in a town like Harlow meant everybody had it before the ink dried. Bernadette called that evening, not about hospital business, just checking in the way people do when they're worried but don't want to say it outright. "You eat today?" "Yes." "That's not really what I wanted to ask." "I know." A pause. "Unit's a mess. Connolly's covering your patients, he's fine, but he's not you. We had a multi-car on the interstate this afternoon." Bernadette caught herself. "I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty. You are a little. That okay?" Mara almost smiled. "Yeah." "Also, 7 people on the unit signed a letter to administration. I didn't organize it, they did it themselves, asking for a review of the suspension." She sat with that after they hung up, 7 people on their own time, writing something down that probably wouldn't move the legal needle an inch, but mattered enough to somebody that they'd put pen to paper anyway. By morning, the courtroom clip was already burning up 3 local news sites. Somebody in the gallery had filmed it on their phone, technically against the rules, but that's how things go these days, and the framing had flipped hard from accused nurse to accused nurse saves officer's life mid-hearing. The Register ran a noticeably softer front page with a quote from the paramedic. Whatever her situation was, the handoff he'd gotten from her was as sharp as anything he'd get from an ER doc. She wasn't faking the medical part, that much was obvious. Pace called the hospital's PR director within the hour, wanting a statement reinforcing the suspension. Standard bureaucratic cover, patient safety, cooperating with the investigation, precautionary measure. The PR director quietly declined. No fanfare, just declined. Told him the situation was evolving and legal had advised holding off. Not the response Pace wanted. He'd expected to be the voice of institutional caution. Instead, the hospital was going quiet, and quiet was starting to look a whole lot like distance from him. That evening, he emailed Mara directly. "I want you to know my actions were motivated entirely by concern for the integrity of this institution and its patients. I hope the truth comes out in a way that is fair to everyone." She forwarded it to Cassidy without comment. Cassidy wrote back one word. "He's scared." Mara wrote back, "Good." For days later, on a pre-dawn run up the Ridge Road, her phone buzzed with a prefix she recognized. She stopped cold and answered, "Captain Voss." Nobody had called her that in 4 years, and it landed different than she expected. Speaking. "My name is Major Diane Rutherford, Army Legal Command. I was contacted 3 days ago about your situation by a judge, Gerald Fun, retired JAG, reached out through a former colleague of mine." A pause. "You're aware of this?" "I made a call. I didn't know who it'd reach. It reached me. Rutherford's voice was professionally neutral, not cold. I've reviewed what I can access, Captain. Some of your files above my clearance, but what I can see explains exactly why Judge Finn got concerned. I'll need 3 to 5 business days to start the appropriate verification request. The office it has to go through doesn't move fast. I understand. The court gave us 3 weeks. That should be enough. A beat. Captain, off the record, why didn't you make this call the second the charge got filed? Mara looked out over the valley. Sun coming up behind the ridge. Frost turning briefly to something like water. I wasn't sure the situation warranted it. You were arrested. I know. For stolen valor. For a medal that belongs to you. I know. And you weren't sure that warranted a call? She didn't have a quick answer for that. The honest one was tangled up in a lifetime of not asking for help. A belief that truth eventually surfaces on its own without needing to be dug up. And a gut feeling that pulling military resources into a personal legal fight felt like grabbing the wrong tool for the job. Not exactly rational. Held on to anyway her whole adult life. I'm making it now, she said. Yes, Rutherford said. You are. Something in her tone wasn't quite approval, wasn't quite sympathy, closer to recognition. I'll be in touch. The days between that call and the next rail break tested a very specific kind of patience. Not the kind where you're hoping for good news, but the kind where you're holding your position while a fight rages around you at a distance you can't fully see. She ran every morning, took care of the dog, avoided the news coverage which had spun off a whole side debate about whether the hospital should have suspended her at all. She called Cassidy every couple days for partial updates, and Cassidy called her back with partial updates of her own, 2 people assembling something in low light. On day 8, the break came from a direction nobody had been watching. Cassidy had been working the edges of the case on no sleep, the way overworked public defenders do when they actually believe in their client, and filed a records request on the original complaint's timeline, specifically how fast the charge got filed and arraigned. Buried in what came back was a message thread between Pace's office and a county administrator named Jerry Holbrook, listed in Sloane's own case materials as a professional reference, disclosed unremarkable looking on paper. The thread showed Holbrook coaching Pace on the exact language for the complaint, not general advice, specific wording that lined up almost word for word with the statutory phrasing of the fraudulent impersonation charge, sent 2 days before the complaint was officially filed, flagged as a courtesy review. Holbrook wasn't a lawyer. He had no official role in any filing. But his long friendship with Sloane, documented right there in Sloane's own reference materials, meant Pace's complaint had gotten off the books coaching from a guy with an off-the-books connection to the prosecutor, before it ever hit anybody's desk. Not proof of outright corruption, something murkier and honestly harder to defend. A casual alignment of interests that had squeezed weeks of process down into days. Cassidy called Mara at 11 that night. Is it actionable? Mara asked. As prosecutorial misconduct? Maybe. Depends whether Finn calls it material coordination or coincidence. Cassidy's voice had that caffeinated, locked-in energy. But here's the thing, even if it doesn't kill the charge outright, it changes the whole story of how this happened. It's not just an administrator filing a complaint and a prosecutor picking it up. There's a connection. Somebody influenced this process before it ever officially started. Mara sat in her kitchen, Ruger asleep in the doorway like always. Send it to me, she said. Then sleep. I'll sleep after I draft the motion. The motion hit Finn's clerk on a Tuesday. By Wednesday afternoon, Finn issued a short order demanding Sloane respond in writing to the coordination allegation within 5 business days, neutral language as judicial orders always are. But the fact that Finn thought it worth a formal response instead of tossing it outright was a message all by itself. Sloane's office called Cassidy's office that same afternoon. The prosecutor was open to a conversation about next steps. Cassidy called Mara right after. He's about to offer a deal. No deal, Mara said, before Cassidy even finished the sentence. Even if it costs more to fight than to take it. Even then, I spent 8 years doing things I can't talk about for people who'll never know my name. I'm not signing a paper that says I lied about who I am. Cassidy made a sound that was half agreement, half frustration, half something harder to name. Okay, no deal. I'll tell them. Tell them in my exact words. I'll paraphrase. Tell them in my words. A dry beat. Most clients I have to talk into fighting. I'm not most clients. No, Cassidy said. You really aren't. Whatever Sloan had planned to offer never made it into the room. His call the next morning ran 12 minutes and ended with nothing on the table, just an agreement to wait on the military verification before either side moved again. Mara's phone rang at 2:17 that afternoon. Major Rutherford's direct line. The verification's already processed, Rutherford said. 11 days, not the 3 to 5 they'd quoted. The office had expedited it after Fun made a second personal contact with someone at DoD Legal. Says exactly what it should say, Rutherford said. It also flagged 2 additional commendations we weren't even looking for. You'll have the formal certification in 72 hours. Mara sat down hard in her kitchen chair, legs doing that thing they do after something huge moves through you, not buckling, just settling like a foundation after a quake. Captain, Rutherford said, voice softening just slightly, I want to say something outside my brief. The people in that unit, the ones you served with, the ones you treated, they already know who you are. That certification's for a courtroom. What they know never needed documentation. The certification landed in 68 hours, not 72, 43 pages of hard copy, formal DoD language, the full citation on the metal, the approval chain, 3 separate offices independently verifying the inscription. It buried Sloan's whole case. The exact personnel designation, classification stripped but the role intact, showing precisely where Mara served and why she'd earned the decoration. Pute's testimony about inconsistent patterns turned out to be technically correct and completely beside the point. Her unit wasn't part of the general pattern. It was the exception the pattern was designed to hide. The document confirmed her rank, 3 commendations, 2 she hadn't expected to ever see in writing, and a record of 17 people saved under hostile conditions in a unit the public record basically pretends doesn't exist. Cassidy read every page twice, tabbing sections in 3 colors, and when she set down the last one she just sat there a second, quiet in a way that wasn't like her. They cited 2 commendations for field medical action under hostile conditions. She finally said, in a unit that doesn't even have a public designation. You saved 17 people, Mara. And Roland Pace filed a complaint saying you stole a medal. Sloan's call came in at 11:14 the next morning. He'd read all 43 pages. He wanted full dismissal with prejudice, plus a formal statement to the court admitting the evidentiary basis had been insufficient. Cassidy gave him until 3 p.m. He agreed. The hearing to formalize it was set for Thursday. But that same evening, before Mara had even let herself feel any of it, Cassidy called back with a different tone entirely. There's a problem. Pace found out about the dismissal, probably through Holbrook's network, and he's already moving. He filed a second complaint. Not the sheriff this time, the state medical board. He was arguing that elements of her service, weapons use, lethal decision-making in combat, should have been disclosed during her original nursing licensure, and he was requesting an emergency review that could suspend her license inside 48 hours, months before any full review even started. He's not trying to win, Mara said, standing at her dark window. No, Cassidy agreed. He's trying to delay, keep the story alive, keep pressure on the hospital board before Fun's dismissal ever clears the record. The board's emergency panel could act fast, faster than the criminal process, and even a thin, easily beaten argument could buy Pace exactly what he needed, provisional suspension while it got sorted out, and a headline that read just as bad as the original one. Mara needed to be in that room. Emergency petitions don't require the subject present unless she formally requests representation. So Cassidy filed the request first thing the next morning. Then Mara called Rutherford at 6:15 and laid out the new situation in under 3 minutes. "He's using what verified you against you," Rutherford said. "What do you need?" "A witness. Someone from Military Legal Command who can appear before the panel and confirm nothing in my classified record represents any risk to patient care." 90 minutes later, Rutherford called back. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Garrick, JAG, held the right civilian liaison qualification, had reviewed the file that morning and agreed to appear. "The panel's tomorrow," Rutherford said. "Garrick's going to say things in that room that are true and documented, and it's going to make some things visible you've kept private your whole life. Are you ready for that?" Mara looked at the photograph on her table, her father's face worn soft from years of handling. "Yes," she said. The emergency panel convened at 9 the next morning, 3 members around a long table, a physician, a nurse practitioner, a licensing attorney, with Pace's lawyer laying out his case with practice polish. Combat experience involving lethal force, he argued, was material to a fitness to practice determination and should have been disclosed up front. When it was Mara's turn, she didn't open with the law. She opened with a patient. "A man came into our trauma bay with 2 entrance wounds and 1 exit wound, pressure falling, and the surgical resident who was supposed to take the case froze," she told the panel, looking straight at them, not her notes. "I managed him for 11 minutes until the attending got there. He survived. His name is Darian Cole, and he still sends our unit a Christmas card every year." The room went quiet. "I'm not telling you this for credit. I'm telling you because every part of my military background, including the parts Mr. Vile is calling a disclosure concern, is exactly why that man is alive. My training under pressure, my ability to function when somebody else can't. My record isn't a risk to my patients. It's the education that serves them." Then Lieutenant Colonel Garrick, appearing by video in dress uniform, laid it out in 11 flat, precise minutes. Nothing in Captain Voss's record indicated any conduct that posed a risk in a clinical setting. If anything, the classified commendations showed a consistent pattern of prioritizing patient welfare under extreme conditions. Pace's attorney asked for a 10-minute recess. Through the hallway glass, Mara watched Pace pacing with his phone to his ear, his face doing something complicated, and when he caught her looking, his expression cracked open for just a second, not anger, something smaller. A man out of angles. His attorney came back and withdrew the petition, unconditionally, on the record. Cassidy gathered her papers with hands that weren't quite steady. "That's twice now," she said. "He's not done." "No," Mara agreed, "but he's running out of institutions." On their way out, the elevator opened and Pace stepped out, maybe having ridden up just to avoid leaving yet. For feet apart, no audience. He opened his mouth. "Don't," she said, quiet, not a threat, just a fact. He closed it. She took the stairs. 3 days before the formal dismissal hearing, the Register ran a story that changed the shape of everything again. A $340,000 gap in a hospital supply audit Mara had flagged 18 months earlier, the same report Pace had quietly archived and buried. It didn't name her. It named him. Within a day, Hospital Legal had a vendor, Vantage Meridian, confirming its billing ran through a secondary account set up 18 months prior at the request of Pace's own office, over $210,000 processed through it, none of it matching physical inventory. Because Harlow County Medical took Medicare and Medicaid money, that made it federal jurisdiction, and Cassidy said the quiet part out loud. This wasn't an administrative irregularity anymore. This was fraud, the kind with subpoenas attached. Mara called a journalist she trusted, handed him the trail, and told him where to look. Not the interview he'd been promised. Something bigger. The dismissal hearing happened that Thursday morning. Garrick seated quietly in the gallery in full dress uniform, visible proof standing behind 43 pages of paper. Fun read the certification summary into the record, more of it than he technically needed to, so that anyone who ever pulled this transcript would see exactly what had been dismissed sitting right next to exactly who she really was. "Ms. Voss," he said, then caught himself. "Captain Voss, the charges against you are dismissed, with prejudice. This court wishes to note that the manner in which this matter was brought reflected an inadequate adherence to verification standards that should have applied before a charge like this was ever filed. You may retrieve your property." The bailiff brought the cedar box back. She opened it, checked the metal, closed it, and didn't make a show of it. Sloane gathered his papers and walked out without looking at anyone. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed, and Cassidy fielded most of it while Mara answered 2 questions and slipped out the side door. Garrick was waiting by his car with government plates. "Colonel," she said. "Captain," he answered, simple, no performance in it. "Thank you for appearing. It was the right thing." He paused. "Major Rutherford wanted you to know your father's record has been added to the permanent citation archive. Some bureaucratic delay had it stuck in a queue. It's done now." She didn't trust her voice for a second. "Thank you," she finally said. He nodded once and drove off, and she stood there a moment in the ordinary parking lot, thinking about what came next, because what came next had already started. Special Agent Derek Ray from the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division called her that same afternoon, wanting to talk about the audit report she'd filed 18 months back. She sat with him in a hospital conference room and laid out everything: the report, the archiving, the vendor documentation, the timeline, answering every question directly, no ornamentation. "When you filed that original report," Ray asked, "did you anticipate this outcome?" "I anticipated it would either get addressed or ignored," she said. "When it got ignored, I kept copies. And waited. For what?" She thought about the courtroom on day 1, the laughter, the metal on the evidence table. "For the right moment," she said. The hospital board didn't wait around. Within days, Roland Pace was placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. His badge stopped working before the criminal case had even fully wrapped. Mara stood before the board herself, 9 minutes, no theatrics, laying out the audit and the timeline and asking for nothing more than to go back to work on the same terms as anyone whose record had been checked and cleared. The board chair told her flat out that the institution's handling of the whole situation had been a failure of due diligence, and that her restraint through all of it frankly put this institution to shame. Her privileges were reinstated that same day. She was back in the trauma bay by noon. 11 weeks later, Roland Pace was indicted on 12 federal counts: wire fraud, healthcare fraud, tied to Vantage Meridian, and 2 more vendor accounts investigators found once they started pulling threads. The scheme running closer to 26 months than 18, the total take far higher than anyone first guessed. Jerry Holbrook cooperated, avoided charges, resigned his post 2 weeks before the indictment dropped. Victor Sloane resigned from the prosecutor's office days after the dismissal hearing and, 5 months later, took a formal censure from the state bar for inadequate verification standards permanent on the record, the kind of thing that follows a career forever. Mara testified as a federal witness when the fraud case went forward, 2.5 hours, direct and complete, never once touching the parts of her service that stayed classified. Those stayed hers, documented now, acknowledged but never public. Deputy Aaron Meade recovered fully and mailed her a plain drugstore card 6 weeks later, signed with his name and badge number, thanking the woman who'd kept him alive with a whole courtroom watching. She kept that card the same way she kept most things that carried real weight. For months out from the dismissal, on an ordinary Tuesday between cases, she found herself standing at a corridor window looking out over the same parking lot where they'd once walked her out in cuffs, and she realized how completely unremarkable the moment felt. Her badge reading green, her patient stable, the unit running the way units run, imperfect and understaffed and entirely itself. She'd lost 3 weeks of her life to a man who mistook her quiet for weakness, who looked at a woman in scrubs who never raised her voice and figured she'd be easy to bury. He was wrong about who he was looking at, but more than that, he was wrong about what actually makes a person dangerous. It was never volume. It was never the willingness to fight loud. It was the willingness to be patient, to hold the full picture steady while the whole world around you tries to make you drop it, and wait for the exact moment the truth finally has enough room to stand up in. She thought about her father, who'd carried his own medal for 22 years without ever once needing to explain it to a soul, who simply occupied a room fully and let the room adjust around him instead of the other way around. She understood now that she'd inherited that from him, but she'd also learned something he never had to. That stillness is a kind of power, not a hiding place, and that you can be quiet your whole life and still know exactly when it's time to get loud. They could take her badge for 3 weeks. They could put her in handcuffs in front of everyone she worked with. They could try to turn her own silence into evidence against her. What they could never touch was the record that actually mattered. The 17 people who came home breathing, the Christmas cards, the 18-year-old in Bay 2 who just wanted to meet the nurse from the news, a deputy's shaky signature on a drugstore card. That record was never in any database. It lived in every room the work had actually happened in, completely outside anyone's reach to erase or dismiss. She laced up her shoes that Saturday morning and ran the ridge road as the sun cracked over the eastern range, frost turning briefly gold across the valley floor, Ruger tearing ahead of her and circling back, purely, uncomplicatedly happy just to be alive and moving. The woman they'd arrested in that hallway hadn't changed one bit. She'd simply, finally, been seen for exactly what she'd always been.